Hello Internet, it's Daniel with Driving and Dragons, and today we will actually be driving since the 280ZX has given me some fits figuring out what's going on with the ignition. I'm having to warranty some parts because I think the ignition coil somehow burnt out, a few other things. I'm not doing as much work on it as I would like right now, so we're going to go back to some driving videos for the time being while I'm getting that sorted out. Part of the gig when you start restoring these old cars, sometimes you fix something and there's another piece that causes what you fixed to become unfixed, and then you gotta chase down the rat maze to figure out what it is. Today's video is something that I kind of struggled with where to put it. I didn't know if this was going to be in my World Builders University World Building 101 playlist or if it belonged in You're Doing It Wrong, because it is about mistakes that we make, but it is definitely a world building video because we're going to go over 7 mistakes. They're not all the mistakes, but there's 7 world building mistakes that get made, and in particular these are world building mistakes that are made focused more on tabletop role-playing games, not so much video games or books, because that is one of the things you find when you start looking on YouTube is there's tons of videos about world building, but unfortunately almost all of them are geared towards writing a story. And even as a narrative game master, you are not writing a story in a tabletop role-playing game. That is one of the biggest problems with modern DMs, is that they go into it with this idea that they are creating a story and the players, basically that their players are just characters in their book. And that's not the case. It's not the extreme emergent storytelling where the game master does nothing but adjudicate the world and lets the players figure everything out. There is a narrative game. You do provide story beats, you do provide a plot, you do provide an active living world that impacts the characters and guides them and drives them towards certain ends in order for the story to emerge. But you're not writing a novel. You don't have that level of control over the characters, and if you do exert that level of control over the characters, you're just going to destroy your own table. So the world building is different slightly in writing a book versus a tabletop role-playing game. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and start moving forward with these 7 world building mistakes that game masters make. The first world building mistake that happens pretty often is either not having a theme or failing to consider one. This is definitely one that happens in a lot of writing too, but it's doubly important for tabletop role-playing games. And the reason is because we're collectively generating the story. In a book, if I make some world building mistakes where something doesn't fit the theme of the world, I can conveniently ignore that. I can look the other way from something that doesn't make sense because I am the one who makes all the decisions, all the thought processes for all the characters, and I am the sole person who is developing any sort of information regarding the world. I'm the only one necessarily asking questions actively as part of the story. You don't have that in a tabletop role-playing game. You got 4 or 5 other people sitting around the table who are going to ask questions, who are going to poke at the edges, who are going to push on the soft spots and see what gives, and who are going to think independently for themselves as the story emerges with those characters. This is part of how you avoid the railroad issue, is because if you have a strong theme running throughout your world and everything is built to support that theme, it's going to make certain pressures on the characters to make certain decisions. Both because if they grew up in a certain kind of world, that means they grew up in certain kinds of cultures, which means if they're playing their characters well, those characters will have those influences. If it's something more direct, such as resource scarcity or a certain type of climate or some other great worldly event type deal, it's going to have the direct effect on the players, or on the player characters rather, which is going to motivate those players to follow the theme, which is part of how you keep them on the track of making the decisions to move forward with the narrative that you're creating without having to railroad them or ham-fistedly shove them in a certain direction. There's a couple of different ways that theme can work in. So let's just take a look at two of them real quick. One is cultural themes. So for instance, if I have some kind of situation where either there's 5 kingdoms that each have a seal that keeps a demon dragon away, and there's some force or some enemy that is working towards opening those seals to get the demon dragon out. Or vice versa, the player characters are tasked with going to these enemy nations, these enemy evil baron, wizard tower, whatever, to unlock these scrolls that are going to release a great good, or are going to give you the way to push out the demon king once and for all. There needs to be something woven through that with the thread. For instance, you have all these nations that have a common collective goal, which is to defend these seals to make sure that this does or doesn't happen. So that is going to inherently influence how they interact with each other on a governmental level. This means you might have populaces, like the general populace, who are antagonistic towards each other. They compete for resources. They think that this group over here is shady and shystery and always trying to be a trickster, while these people over here are brutes with no manners, or whatever the case may be. They're opposed, but the only reason that they are not at war with each other or more antagonistic or work together is because the highest levels, now this population, they're antagonistic and they don't understand it. They're always talking about, well, why does the king not do this? Why doesn't he take care of those people over there who are always cheating us? Why don't they take care of those scumbags over there, those brutes that are always so uncouth and just destroy everything they go to? Because the kings know that they each have a seal to protect. They have a common goal that they have to work together towards, so they have to minimize the amount of outward impact that these kind of decisions have. They have to think not only twice but 3 times before they pull the trigger on something. And it makes it a much bigger deal if they do have that antagonism. Flip side, you're going in, you have 2 enemy nations or 2 enemy nobles who are pretty antagonistic towards each other and look like they should never be able to work together well at all. But when the player characters start trying to work against them, that forms a quick unified front under the dual iron gauntlets of 2 tyrants. And the players are, why is this happening? Well, it's because they have this common goal, which means they have this common history. It has influenced them throughout their entire, throughout their lineage going back several generations. Because the magic seal didn't just suddenly appear here right now. It is part of that family history, it is part of that nation's history, and it's going to influence their character and identity. Now the second thing is, instead of cultural themes, let's talk about themes for the world itself, like physical themes. Take a desolate world where everybody kind of fights for scraps, like a water world or a Mad Max or Dark Sun or something of that nature. Everything is scarce, everybody is fighting for scraps. There's a couple of things you need to have here. For one, you don't need to necessarily have any big strong nations or big well-developed cities and stuff, because if resources are scarce, even gathering them all into one place is still going to be a big downgrade from what it would be anywhere else. Things that would normally be commonplace, such as big stone fortifications, don't exist because stone's not that common. Metal is hard to come by, whatever the case may be. It's not only harder for the individual, it's harder for the groups to come together and form strong units. Also, you don't want to create a resource scarce environment, for instance, that has biomes that naturally have large amounts of resources. They got big, strong hardwood forests, they've got swamps and peat moss bogs and all this other stuff, and all it takes is one player. This is where that whole book thing comes into play, where you can just kind of not mention it and let it brush it under the rug if you're writing a book. But a tabletop role-playing game, you got that player who's like, oh, a bog? That means I should have peat, I should have sulfur, I should be able to get this, that, or the other. I should be able to do this with these hardwoods. If there's hardwoods, I should have these kind of moss and this kind of undergrowth and this kind of vines and this kind of whatever. If we have this kind of rock, I should be able to make this, this, and this out of it, because I know the history of what limestone or shale or granite or whatever that you're saying this mountain range was made out of, what minerals it should have, what's associated with it. So now your mineral rich world, or your mineral poor, your resource scarce world doesn't make sense because you have provided a biome that doesn't fit the theme, and a player has called you on it, and you've got a break because you're telling me this thing is here, and if it's here, that means I must have these things in order for it to exist, i.e. I'm no longer mineral scarce, or I'm no longer resource scarce. And now your player is going to take over the entire world because he's the only person who can pull the oil out of the ground or who can make steel because you messed up and gave him a hint that shows him where he can have carbon and iron and make steel. So not following your theme or not considering a theme or not having one can really cause breakdowns in future development in your world. So mistake number 2 is failing to consider the influences of whatever changes you're making, whatever things you include in your world, what they would have on culture and society. So for instance, the classic example is you take a AD&D type world, and what do we have? We have a generic medieval European theme with generic medieval feudal system, with medieval style nations, but we have this high magic world and it doesn't make sense. Why? Because a lot of the stuff that works in the high Middle Ages doesn't work when you introduce magic. In a lot of ways, magic is a stand-in for technology anyway, and you can see the things that are no longer done in the way that system no longer works from the presence of this magic. This extends beyond the simple stuff like you're not going to have pike formations when every town has a wizard who can fireball said pike formation out of existence. You're not going to have castles when everybody can cast fly spells, levitate, or has wyvern mounts or whatever, because castles don't make sense with the air superiority situation or with the heavy artillery of lightning bolts and fireballs, etc. But beyond that, you're going to have a lot of things that were never invented in the first place. Let's just go on a hot button topic here. Do you know why combat wheelchairs and magical wheelchairs and stuff in Dungeons and Dragons is just the dumbest thing on the planet? Because a wheelchair would never have existed in that world. In a world where if I have legs that don't work, I can go to the priest and the priest prays over me and I automatically have legs that work again. Wheelchairs never exist because the problem that wheelchairs were invented to solve never exists in the first place. You never have the problem that's needed to invent it. As a matter of fact, think of what the effect on medicine would be. Why would we ever have medicine developed beyond basic first aid in a world where any priest of the lowest levels can pray and fix just about any ailment under the sun? The answer is you wouldn't have it. You need to have reasons why these things exist if they do, or you need to say, what would the influence be? I'm going to give a prime example, not only of an influence situation in world building, but also in how our thinking tends to miss the obvious and miss the important, and where this mistake kind of shows its ugly head a lot. You will often hear these theories, these alternate history things. They'll talk about, what if somebody took a crate of M4 rifles back to the Civil War and gave it to one side or the other? What would that swing the war, given the South modern military rifles, say 100 M4s? I'm going to tell you right now, that would have a huge effect. It would have a huge effect. I seriously doubt it would change the way that war went, but it would definitely have made some things way more difficult for the Union. But I'm going to tell you this right now. You can give the Union Army twice the number. You can give them 200, 250 M4s. You can give them SEAL Team 6. And I'm going to give the South radios. A couple of crates of radios. Now all of a sudden the South, that has no SEAL Team 6, no modern rifles, has nowhere near the resources, has nowhere near the ability to prosecute war, has nowhere near the soldiers, and has all the disadvantages. And they're going to wipe the Union out. They're going to defeat them without even trying. Why? Because the South now has the ability to instantly communicate. You no longer have the miscommunications that lead to things like Pickett's charge and the messes up the field, the fish hook and whatnot. You no longer have general orders that are written down and wrapped around a pack of cigars being found by Union soldiers in the middle of a field. Yes, that actually happened. You no longer have Confederate troops ever being out of position, and if they were ever out of position, instantaneously they can be brought back. Stonewall Jackson is no longer killed by his own side because he's already radio ahead and told the people he's going to that, hey, we're the good guys, don't shoot us. And you don't lose Stonewall Jackson. The communication, way more important than the weapons. Think about that in your feudal society D&D world, where a message spell or a whisper spell or some kind of crystal ball or something changes everything. Not only do you need to have answers for how that's going to influence the cultures around you and the world around you, but then you also need to have answers for what countermeasures are in place, because the government is still going to have more resources and more abilities than the general populace in most cases, and you're still going to have those situations. But you need to ask yourself whether it's cybernetics, whether it's magic, divine power, space age, unobtainium, made-up material, whatever element you've introduced into your world, how would it affect the culture? What would it have changed going all the way back to the beginning? Because, like I said with the healing spell, medicine was never even researched because it was never a problem. So what new issues is this going to present for your players? Mistake number 3. This is going to be an easy one for you. I'm going to refer to this one broadly as pallet swapping. Okay, pallet swapping, term from old school video games back when video games were on cartridges and whatnot, and you didn't have a ton of graphical resources. So a lot of times an enemy would simply be a different color for the next strongest version. You would swap the color palette from a blue enemy to a green enemy to a red enemy to make them a different version that's more powerful. So what do I mean by palette swapping in your TTRPG world building? Well, we come into these great ideas where we want to subvert expectations, where we want to, play a twist on something, and we're going to have this world, and orcs are going to be totally different, or they're going to be a race of scientists, they're going to be a race of thinkers and philosophers, or elves are going to be completely different than what they are. They're going to be the short, instead of being the tall, golden-haired, immortal type, they're going to be like the trickster, pixie type. And we create these worlds, and we create these races, and we take the shortcut, which is perfectly acceptable, of stealing something from another source. We steal the races out of the player's handbook when we do a Dungeons and Dragons campaign. And we say, okay, well, there's no dragonborn because there's no dragons, so you can't do that. And there's no tieflings or Isomars because we don't have, the planar bridge, or their races are not compatible, so you can't actually have tieflings or Isomar. But then you start going into your halfling, half-orc, etc., and you just palette swap. Well, what do I mean you just palette swap? Well, now all of a sudden orcs are an intellectual society, and they have a society that values discourse and is kind of like ancient Greece and has prototypical democracy, and they're still kind of a warrior race, but they have these features. But they still have +2 to strength and -2 to intelligence and charisma. But the orcs are different in this world. The elves are, these little tricksters that, talk their way out of things, but we still leave them with the same abilities. We just palette swapped them. They're the same damn thing. We just said, here's a fresh coat of paint. This is for just about anything. You don't want to just simply palette swap things and have it be exactly the same, particularly when that doesn't make sense. It goes back to our interwoven theme. Our theme is interwoven throughout all of our world building. It advises all of our world building. And if we don't make logical changes to the races or the machinery or the way societies operate in our game simply because we don't want to take the work and we're just going to copy paste it out of the game master's book or the keeper's guide or the handbook or whatever. We have now harmed our world building by simply applying the palette swap band-aid. Congratulations, orcs are now good guys who love poetry, but their charisma still sucks ass. Well, how do you have orcs being the traitors and diplomats of the world with no charisma? Don't just palette swap things out of the system. Make sure you make the adjustments across the board to make things work. So mistake number 4 in your tabletop role-playing game world building. This one I'm going to refer to as Hamfisted Anachronism. This will reflect more on some of the more modern GMs out there because, especially with the younger GMs and certain sects of society, the thing that's in vogue is to project your modern philosophies, your modern sociology, and your current political, religious, whatever beliefs, your cultural beliefs, into your game world. And we have become rife with ham-fisted allegory. Now, Dark Sun did this really well. Dark Sun is a great setting. And Dark Sun is an allegory for global warming. That's what it is. It is essentially magic global warming or magical climate change. That's what Dark Sun is. The world is completely destroyed because magic ran amok, and it ran amok because people were irresponsible with it and abused the power and drained the resources, etc., etc. It's essentially global warming magic version. And it does it very well because everybody can play Dark Sun and it doesn't hit them in the face. It will hit your characters in your face, and it will take them out of the world when you start ramming modern sensibilities and modern thought processes into your game. For instance, if you're going to make, I'm going to go back to the Civil War again because it's useful and it's easy in this case. If you have a Civil War era game, but you have these modern thoughts on race and slavery and whatnot rife throughout the game, you're going to take your players out of it because they're going to look at it and say, this, once again, this does not make sense. This is not how these people could, would, or did behave. So you don't want to be too ham-fisted, too blatant, too on the nose with whatever you're trying to put into your game. If you want to have a game that has an allegorical theme that, say, talks about communism, for example, and how communism is a problem, you don't basically have the Marxism world where everything is just a caricature of Marxism that would never have come up in whatever era you happen to be working in, whether it's a cyberpunk style game or like a medieval type setting. What you need to do in those kind of cases, let's just say communism is the thing you're going against in this case, you want to pick out all of the things that communism does wrong, all of the freedoms it crushes, all of the problems it causes, and how it causes those problems, and you want to weave them into your world that way, in a way that makes sense for the era that it's in, not just copy-pasting a modern nation-state and dropping it in the Middle Ages or dropping it in the future. And it is kind of funny because Star Trek Deep Space Nine unintentionally ripped apart the communist utopian vision of Star Trek The Next Generation. And it did it because you had Cisco acting like somebody in the real world when he said, you know what the problem with Earth is? You look outside and you see paradise. Everything is gone and things don't work like that out here on the frontier. And that enriched that Star Trek world 100,000 times and unintentionally made it kind of anti-communist, which I always found kind of funny. You got to do the same stuff with your world building. If you want to build a world that is an allegory against, let's just say you want to have some sort of racial allegory to it, you want to do it like X-Men. You don't want to do it where Martin Luther King with pointy ears marches down Birmingham, Alabama, the Duke of Birmingham Street, and it just hits everybody in the face, when it's like, that wouldn't happen in this world. It wouldn't happen in this society because people are worried more about eating and where they're going to get their harvest in. They're not going to be marching in the streets because they're all going to starve to death over the winter because they're subsistence living. The Duke just shuts this down because he is the sole authority. There's no council, there's no Congress, there's no republic to work through. So if you're going to do something allegorical, or you want to push some kind of message, or even if it's just a theme that you want to include in your game that is more of a modern take, make sure that you don't cross the line into something truly anachronistic that takes your players out of the game. Make sure it's something that has been modified to the point that it fits like it's supposed to be there in the first place. Dovetailing off that, we have world building mistake number 5 for your TTRPG. This is conflict that makes no sense, including conflict in your game world that does not make any sense whatsoever. Wars throughout history typically are fought over resources. There might be 100,000 other reasons that are stated for it, be it religious, be it ethnic, be it philosophical, but 9 times out of 10, if you really boil it down, almost every war that's ever been fought in human history has been economic. It has been trying to get a certain kind of resource from another person. It is, I need the Donbass region, or I need Crimea because it has access to ports, because Black Sea ports and deep water ports, because it has oil reserves off the coast. I need to go into the Middle East because there's oil reserves. We didn't need to go into the Middle East before they found black gold underneath it. It's, I need access to this fishing area, to this bay, this river, rivers in, when you start looking at old world, like pre 1800 era, so your medieval, your Renaissance, your Iron Age, whatever, where a lot of our fantasy TTRPGs are set. Rivers are incredibly important because they are essentially the superhighways of those worlds, and these are the kind of things that wars are fought over. So when you are bringing conflict into your game world, you need to make sure that these conflicts make sense and they're not just a set piece for these people are going to war so that I have something to give my characters action to take part in. You want conflict to make sense. This side has something that this side doesn't. And this side developed culturally in a different way than this side did, and there's a reason for it. So for instance, you have the bad guys who are the nomadic raiders who are always trying to take over more land, who are attacking the peace-loving democratic society, and your players are going to go defend it. The defenders of Christendom, or whatever it happens to be for your game world. Why is it that way? Well, you take a look at these warlike clans that are coming in. They are coming from a world of scarcity, the desert, the tundra, the steppes, where they don't have very much, and they fight every day for every next breath. They are hunters, they are expert killers, and to get things beyond that, they either have to buy, sell, steal, or trade for them, and a lot of times they choose steal and fight. They have to expand to get more. They have to come into your area to get your resources, because otherwise they don't have them. You don't want to have, in your safe democracy, your safe republic, your safe goodly king, part of the reason he's a goodly king is because he has deep forests and rivers and bays, and he has access to all these resources and all this abundance and this rich farmland. Now you have conflict that makes sense. What you don't want is, okay, here's the bad guys and they already have everything and they're coming to attack the poor people over here because that's what they need to do. Rich people need to rob poor people because they don't already have everything. Make sure your conflict makes sense in your game world. When you are world building, you need to say, if these two cultures are opposed, why are they opposed and why did they develop that way? Why does this nation have this mentality that makes them diametrically opposed to this group over here? How did that come about? Same thing internally. If you have a rebellion, why are they rebelling? What has caused them to rebel? Because the funny thing about it is that there's two types of people that make awful revolutionaries. There's two types of nations that are very stable. Extremely poor, singular resource dictatorships where all of the wealth of the nation can be made from fighting, killing, digging stuff up out of the ground. There's not a lot of skill there. And then extremely educated, extremely wealthy democracies and republics. And then all your revolution happens in the halfway ground. Because on one hand, a starving slave who can barely get up in the morning makes a pretty bad revolutionary. If he does rebel, he just gets killed. All he wants to do is keep his nose down and not get his hand cut off for not working fast enough. On the other side, that healthy, well-educated, happy, always has a roof over his head, always has a hot meal on the table, doesn't go hungry guy, he may not like what's going on. He may have issues with the government. He may not like the king or whatever. But when he gets mad and he goes home to get his sword out of the closet or pull his gun off the wall, he walks through and he sees his family that's well fed, his kids that don't have to worry, his house that doesn't have roof leaks, or he sees his 4 TVs and that car that he's working on in the garage. And, he's like, you know what? No, by the time he gets to the back, he's like, it's not worth losing all this to fight. So even internally, you also have to have conflicts that make sense. What is it that is so bad that has made this rebellion happen and gives it the ability to have steam to where it's just not crushed down by the populace? Because, the population's not going to rebel if everything's good, if it's just kind of made up BS. So what is the real cause there? Likewise, what is the government actually doing? What is the nation actually doing? What is the Lord actually doing that gives credence to this rebellion? Everything needs to have every conflict needs to make sense. That's really what it comes down to. The number 6 world building mistake that will mess up your TTRPG is to have an inconsistent world. You have developed a world that does not follow the same rules everywhere. You have developed a world that establishes things in one case. For instance, it establishes that a certain resource works a certain way. It establishes that magic works a certain way. It establishes that certain things can and can't be done with cybernetics. It establishes that faster than light travel requires certain, either a certain type of fuel or certain time frame to calculate the jump or whatever the case may be. And for whatever reason, with no external cause, you have other nations, other factions, other groups that can violate these rules or simply ignore them. When you have inconsistencies, when something is a problem for everybody except for this group over here, and it's not that there's a reason why it's not a problem for them, it's just not a problem for them, those inconsistencies can break your world. This can kind of flow into some of the other less important world building stuff, such as, splitting rivers, dividing rivers, weird mountain chains, stuff that doesn't focus on the way plate tectonics would really work, etc., etc. That is not so much of a problem unless it comes into conflict with, say, your theme or conflict with the rest of the world. So you can do the same thing when you look at some of the other world building videos I put out when I talk about different bands and different zones and building consistently. It all comes back to that. You want to have consistent adherence to your theme. You want to have consistent rules. And you want to have a consistent progression societally based on certain factors. If you don't have that consistency, it can be jarring, and it's once again something that's just going to take your players out of the world. It's going to hurt their immersion when things don't, they learn the way things are supposed to work. They learn that A plus B equals C, and then suddenly for no reason A plus B equals D, or A plus B equals A minus, and it doesn't make any sense to them, and there's no reason for it, simply because you have an inconsistency. You decided you wanted to run a certain kind of adventure, and it doesn't make sense with other rules that have been established in your world. You want to be consistent. There are no rules for me and not for thee without a damn good reason. You must be consistent. Here we are, number 7, the final world building mistake for TTRPGs that I'm putting in this video. And to me, this one may be the hardest for myself. And I believe it's the hardest for a lot of people who are happily forever game masters. Because most of us forever game masters, the reason we're the forever GM is because we really like creating and crafting and seeing how our friends interact with and enjoy what we've created. And this is going to be something that is equally bad in both writing a book or a novel as it is in a tabletop role-playing game, and that is the classic world builder disease of being buried in the details. On one side, I'm going to say an absolute heresy right now. Matter of fact, I ought to put this in the title as clickbait, but Tolkien was a horrible world builder for a tabletop role-playing game. He is the master world builder in every other way, but for a tabletop role-playing game, not so much. Because what he did is he crafted such a detailed world. He had everything written out so well. There is nothing left. As a matter of fact, he very famously left Tom Bombadil and even put Tom Bombadil in the Fellowship of the Ring specifically to have something that didn't have answers. And even in his earlier works and in earlier parts of his works, when he had things that didn't have definitive answers, he spent most of his life giving them definitive answers. Why is this bad for a TTRPG? Well, for 2 reasons. One, if you're like me, your players want to play every other week. Some people want to play every week. You're supposed to have game night on Saturday. If you're buried up to your eyeballs trying to figure out how many points the leaves of the falafel tree have, you are wasting time that is meaningless detail your players don't need, that is not impactful to the game, that is not impactful to the story, that could be spent developing the adventures and developing the NPCs, and more importantly, thinking ahead to what the players may do or say so that you have meaningful answers to create a flowing, natural dialogue at the table. So you have a massive time sink. It also leads to you not ever getting anything done. The other part of being buried in detail is that it doesn't leave breathing room for your players to develop the story for you. Like I said, it's a collaborative storytelling game. And this is where narrative game masters get it wrong, is they try to build it in so much that when you have built so much detail, so rich detail into your world, that you have answers for everything, that does lead to a type of railroading where there's only one logical answer for the players to take. They only have one logical response for their characters to move forward with because you have put in every contingency possible as much as you can, and you have built it out so much that the world is going to run without them and there's no way they can have any influence on it. I'm going to put a little bit of a caveat here on buried in detail. There are 2 different types of world building that you have to understand here, and there's 2 different philosophies. If you are planning on building a campaign setting that you want to sell or produce commercially, or you want to, even if it's free, you want to put it out there for other game masters to run adventures and stuff like that in, you have to have way more detail than you do if you're just doing it for your table. In your table, you only need to world build in so much as your players are going to encounter, and maybe 2 steps beyond to answer questions if they start digging. And then beyond that, all you need to do is be able to pull it out of your ass. I mean, and it's perfectly permissible to say you don't know, and your character wouldn't know, and there's no way your character would know, because there's a lot of stuff you can think about it. How much history do you know as an individual? How much history, world history, do you think an average medieval peasant knew? It's perfectly admissible to say you would have no idea. Like, you can't think that far into it. And then when it comes to a published adventure, yes, you have to have a lot more detail. You have to have more answers. You have to have things way more fleshed out, how the economy works, how currency exchange works, how different nations interact with each other, far more history, far more lineage, so that your game masters that you're either selling or providing the world to can work. but you still need far less detail than, say, Middle Earth, because you also have to have breathing room for those game masters to insert adventures and stories into. Otherwise, you're not providing them with a world setting or a campaign setting. You are providing them with a campaign script. And that's not what you're trying to do, even if you're going to the extent of making a commercially viable product. This is one of the places where a great writer breaks from a great GM. A great writer can go to this level of extent and detail. A great GM cannot, because if you get too buried in the details, A, you're not going to ever finish anything, B, you're not going to get any of your adventures done, and C, you're going to make it to where it is very difficult for your characters or for other GMs to operate within your setting without coming across problems that they're running up against, quote unquote, the lore. Remember, the lore is not as important. You are making a setting, not a script. A setting means there's a stage, there's pieces, there's rules, but everything else is going to be what the actors put out. So, that's what I've got for this video. I hope that these 7 tips help out with your world building. And let me know in the comment section below if you've made these mistakes before. Let me know in the comment section below if you think some of these mistakes are not actually mistakes for some reason. Either way, I'd love to have a discussion about it. World building is something that I really enjoy doing. And what are some of the big mistakes that you see in role-playing, specifically as it relates to tabletop role-playing games? I'll see you guys next time.